People like to say I'm independent, that I can handle things on my own, that I don't really need anyone anymore. And for a long time, I believed that was a compliment. I thought being strong meant I'd earned the right to matter, that when something important finally happened in my life, someone would show up without being asked. But here's the uncomfortable truth: sometimes your independent now isn't praise. It's permission to disappear. If this sounds familiar, stay with me. Like the video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe, because this story might change how you see your family forever. I've always been the kind of kid people didn't worry about. I was the oldest. I figured things out early. If something broke, I fixed it. If something hurt, I dealt with it quietly. My parents used to say it like it was a compliment. Elena's fine. She's independent. She doesn't need much. And I learned, very young, how to live up to that sentence. I packed my own lunches before anyone asked. I filled out my own school forms when they were left on the counter too long. If a ride didn't show up, I walked. If no one called back, I stopped calling. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't want to be a problem. Somewhere along the way, not causing trouble became my personality. If my brother needed help, the house shifted around him, schedules changed, voices got softer, attention moved. When it was me, there was usually a pause. Then someone would say, "You'll be okay." And that was the end of it. I told myself that meant trust. That meant respect. That meant I'd earned something. I didn't realize, at the time, that being easy to ignore isn't the same thing as being strong. By the time I was an adult, no one checked in anymore. Not because they didn't love me, but because they were used to my silence. If I didn't bring something up, it didn't exist. If I didn't ask, it wasn't offered, and I rarely asked. There's a moment like that in a lot of families. The moment when a child starts handling things on their own. On the surface, it looks healthy. It looks like growth. It sounds like they're doing great. But there's a difference between becoming capable and becoming invisible. No one really asks which one happened. When adults say, "You're old enough now," it can mean two very different things. Sometimes it means, "I trust you." Sometimes it means, "I'm stepping back." The language sounds the same. The impact isn't. When you grow up needing less, people start giving less, and eventually, they forget you ever needed anything at all. I didn't throw tantrums. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't cry in front of them. So there was nothing to fix. If something went wrong, I adjusted. If something hurt, I internalized it. If something important happened, I assumed I'd handle it alone. That pattern didn't start with big moments. It started with small ones. A meeting no one came to. A phone call that didn't get returned. A sorry. We're busy that never came with a follow-up. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone would apologize for. Just absence. Repeated often enough to feel normal. I remember opening the fridge late at night once, after a long day. It was empty except for a bottle of water and an old container of leftovers. I stood there longer than I needed to. Not because I was hungry, but because it felt familiar. That's what my role had become. I'd make do. And here's the thing. No one tells you about being the easy one. The more you prove you can survive without support, the less likely anyone is to offer it. People don't stop showing up because they hate you. They stop because you've trained them not to worry. They assume silence means stability. They assume independence means immunity. They don't see the cost. I didn't question it for a long time. I thought this was just what adulthood looked like. You handle your own stuff. You don't need applause. But part of me still believed that when something really mattered, when it was obvious that this was a moment you don't miss, someone would notice. Someone would show up without being reminded. That belief didn't come from entitlement. It came from something much simpler. Hope. The hope that being reliable wouldn't make me disposable. The hope that being strong wouldn't make me forgettable. I didn't want special treatment. I just didn't want to be optional. And that's the quiet danger of being the child who doesn't need much. One day, you realize people have taken you at your word. They believe you're fine. They believe you don't require presents. They believe your milestones can wait. And by the time you notice the pattern, it's already settled in. This is just how it works now. I didn't confront anyone about it. I didn't call it neglect. I didn't accuse. I just kept showing up for myself. And the more I did, the more everyone else stepped back. If you've ever been that person, the one who carries things quietly, the one everyone assumes will be okay, you already know how this feels. You don't explode. You don't collapse. You just get used to being alone in rooms that are supposed to be full. And the hardest part isn't the loneliness. It's realizing that your strength might be the very reason no one thinks to stand beside you anymore. It didn't start with shouting. It started with language. Small phrases that sounded reasonable, polite, even. You're independent now. It's not that serious. You're reading too much into it. Every time I tried to explain how something felt, those words showed up first. Not to hurt me, to end the conversation. If I brought up being disappointed, someone would smile and say I was sensitive. If I mentioned feeling left out, they'd say I was overthinking. If I paused too long, they'd remind me I was strong. Strong people don't complain. Strong people don't need reassurance. Strong people handle it. So I handled it. There was a night I remember clearly. I had just gotten home late, exhausted, still wearing my work clothes. I opened the fridge. It was mostly empty. I stood there longer than I needed to, not because I expected someone to have cooked for me, but because that empty space felt familiar. That's what those conversations did. They cleared everything out and told me it was fine. When I tried to say, that hurt, the response wasn't anger. It was dismissal. Don't be dramatic. It wasn't intentional. You're making it bigger than it is. And just like that, the feeling became the problem, not what happened, not the absence, not the choice. My reaction. That's the part people don't talk about. How quickly a boundary turns into an inconvenience. How easily pain gets reclassified as personality. Once that happens, nothing else has to change. If you're upset, you're difficult. If you're quiet, you're fine. Either way, the system stays comfortable. I noticed how careful I became with my words. I'd rehearse things in my head before saying them. I'd soften sentences, add disclaimers. I'm not mad. I know it's not a big deal, but I might be wrong. But I learned to shrink my feelings before anyone else could, because every time I didn't, the same thing happened. The conversation ended. The topic changed. Everything got neatly put back into silence. That's what Don't Be Dramatic really did. It didn't calm me down. It shut me down. It taught me that expressing pain would cost more than hiding it. So I stopped trying to explain. I wrote things down instead. Little notes. Dates. What was said. What wasn't. Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I needed evidence that I wasn't imagining it. That's the part no one sees. When you're constantly told nothing is wrong, you start collecting proof that something is not for them, for yourself. I'd look at my phone after conversations, scrolling back through messages, reading the same lines again, just to check. Did that really happen? Did I make that up? Or did they actually say that I remember asking myself a question I never expected to ask? If I'm always alone in these moments, is that a coincidence? Or is that a pattern that was the first time the word alone felt accurate? Not lonely, alone. Because loneliness implies someone is missing. This felt more like I wasn't expected to be there in the first place. And every time I tried to point it out, the response stayed the same. You're fine. You'll get over it. This isn't worth a fight. So nothing ever became worth addressing. The silence didn't come from one argument. It came from 100 small ones that never happened. Each one closed with the same message. Your feelings are inconvenient. Your reaction is the issue. Please adjust. And I did. I adjusted my tone, my expectations, my presence, until there was almost nothing left to react to. That's how things get quiet without anyone agreeing to it. Not through cruelty, through comfort. Everyone else stayed comfortable. I learned how to stay quiet. But here's what no one tells you. When a feeling gets dismissed enough times, it doesn't disappear. It changes form. It turns into distance, into numbness, into a kind of cold clarity. You stop asking for understanding. You stop hoping for repair. You start observing. And once you're observing, you're no longer inside the family dynamic. You're standing just outside it, taking notes. That's when silence stops being peaceful. It becomes evidence. Evidence that the problem was never how I said things. It was that saying them at all disrupted something they didn't want to look at. If you've ever been told you were too much for reacting to something that hurt you, ask yourself this. If you were me, how many times would you try to explain before you realized the explanation wasn't the issue? Because at some point, being told to calm down isn't about your emotions anymore. It's about keeping everything else exactly the same. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice. The day of the announcement came faster than I expected. I woke up early, even though I didn't need to. My body was already tense, like it knew something important was about to happen. I checked my phone before I got out of bed. No messages, no missed calls. I told myself that was normal. I showered, got dressed, packed my bag. I moved through the morning on autopilot, the way I always did when I didn't want to think too much. On the drive there, I kept glancing at the clock, not because I was late, because I was waiting for a text, waiting for someone to say, "We're on our way," waiting for proof that this moment mattered to more than just me. The building was already busy when I arrived. People were greeting each other, shaking hands, laughing a little too loudly. I recognized faces from work, colleagues, city officials, people who had read my name on documents before they ever said it out loud. I took my seat near the front. I scanned the room without thinking. I knew where my family would sit if they came. I had pictured it more times than I realized. That section stayed empty. At first, I assumed they were running late. Traffic, parking, something small. That's what I always assumed. The presentation started on time. The lights dimmed. The first speaker stepped up. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I checked. Nothing from them. Just an email notification I'd already read. I put the phone face down on my lap. When my name was announced, I stood up. There was applause. Polite, professional. I walked toward the stage, aware of every step, every breath. I could hear my shoes against the floor. Halfway there, I looked out again. The seats were still empty, not delayed, not confused, just empty. I stood behind the podium and adjusted the microphone. My hands were steady. I noticed that before anything else, I started speaking. I talked about the project, the planning, the work that went into it. The words came out exactly how I'd practiced them, clear, controlled. From the outside, I probably looked calm. Inside, something very specific was happening, a realization. Not that they weren't there, but that no one was surprised, no one whispered, "Where's your family?" No one looked around. This wasn't a scene, it was just a fact. I kept going. I explained timelines, impact, next steps. I answered questions. I nodded when people nodded back. The entire time, I was aware of the empty space in the room, like a missing piece everyone had learned to ignore. When it was over, people came up to congratulate me. They shook my hand. They said my name with respect. Someone took out their phone and asked for a photo. I stood next to them and smiled. After a few of those, I stepped aside and pulled out my own phone. Still nothing. No apology. No explanation. Not even a message asking how it went. I told myself I'd check later. I gathered my things and walked outside. The air felt different. Too quiet. I sat in my car for a minute before starting the engine. I stared at the steering wheel, then at my hands resting on it. That's when it hit me. Not anger, not shock, certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. I drove home slowly. I didn't turn on the radio. At a stoplight. I checked my phone again. Nothing. When I got back to my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and dropped my bag by the door. I went straight to the kitchen. The fridge was empty except for a bottle of water and takeout I hadn't finished the night before. I leaned against the counter and took a sip. Standing there, in that quiet space, it finally made sense. There hadn't been a fight. There hadn't been a dramatic moment. They didn't have to say they wouldn't come, they just didn't show up. And that was louder than any argument. I replayed the morning in my head, the empty phone, the empty seats, all the times I'd been told I was independent, all the times I'd been reassured that they trusted me. I realized something then that I hadn't allowed myself to think before. Being alone in that room wasn't new. It was just visible. That's the thing about milestones. They don't create absence. They reveal it. If you were me, sitting there with a full room and no one in it for you, what would you call that bad timing? A mistake or a pattern that finally stopped hiding? I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone to vent. I took out my notebook and wrote down the date, just the date, and what happened, because I knew, in that moment, that this would matter later. This wasn't the breaking point yet, but it was the proof that when it came time to stand beside me, no one chose to. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. I closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf. The room was quiet. I was alone. And for the first time, I understood that this silence wasn't accidental. It was the consequence of every time I'd been told, "You'll be fine." Standing there, I asked myself one question. If this wasn't the moment they showed up, what moment would be? And for the first time, I didn't expect an answer. They didn't call that night, or the next day. A week passed, and nothing changed. No. How did it go? No, we're sorry we missed it. No explanation waiting in my voicemail. Life moved on the way it always did when I stopped expecting things. Then, almost 2 weeks later, my phone rang. It wasn't a familiar sound anymore. I stared at the screen for a second before answering. My dad's voice was calm, too calm. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the event. He asked a question instead. What's going on online I didn't understand at first. He explained that someone had shared a clip from the announcement, a short video, my name, the project, the empty seats behind me. Apparently, people noticed. Apparently, people asked questions. He said it like that was the real problem, not the absence, not the silence, the attention. My mom called later that day. She sounded worried, not about me, about what this might look like. She said neighbors were asking why they weren't there. She said someone from church mentioned it. She said a business contact brought it up casually, like it was nothing. It's becoming a thing, she said. That's when I understood. They didn't miss me. They missed control. When I was alone, it didn't matter. When it was quiet, it didn't count. But once the silence became visible, once there were witnesses, everything shifted. They wanted to explain, they wanted to clarify, they wanted to smooth it over, not with me, with everyone else. I hung up and sat there for a while. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clear in a way that doesn't come with adrenaline or tears. Clear in a way that feels cold. I thought about all the times I tried to explain how I felt. All the times I was told it wasn't that serious. And now, suddenly, it was serious. Not because I was hurt, but because it had consequences. That word stayed with me. Consequences. For a long time, I believed I had two choices. Disappear quietly, or say something and be dramatic. That's how it was framed. If I stayed silent, I was mature. If I spoke up, I was difficult. So I stayed silent. But silence isn't neutral. It teaches people what they can get away with. And declaring the truth isn't the same as asking for permission. That took me a while to understand. You don't speak up to change people. You speak up to stop participating in the lie. I realized something else too. There's a difference between disappearing and leaving. Disappearing is when you hope they'll notice you're gone. Leaving is when you've already noticed what they're doing. I didn't rush into anything. I listened. Every call after that followed the same pattern. Concern about image, concern about timing, concern about fallout. None of them asked the question that mattered. Did we hurt you instead? I got variations of, this is being misunderstood. We didn't mean it that way. We need to fix this. Fix the story, not the damage. I started writing things down again. Dates, who called, what they said. Not out of spite, out of self-respect. I needed to know I wasn't rewriting history in my head. Because when people only respond to exposure, it becomes tempting to doubt yourself. To wonder if you're exaggerating. I had evidence. Evidence of silence when it was just me. Evidence of urgency when others started watching. That contrast changed everything. It showed me where I stood. Not as a daughter. As a variable. Something that could be ignored until it affected the equation. That's when the question stopped being, should I say something, and became, What do I need to survive this with my dignity intact? Some people choose to disappear. They change their number. They move away. They close the door without a word. That path keeps you safe. It also leaves questions behind. Other people stand still and speak once, not to negotiate, not to convince, just to mark the truth. I didn't know which one I was yet. I only knew this. If I stayed silent now, after seeing how quickly they reacted to consequences, I'd be teaching them the same lesson all over again, that I only mattered when it cost them something, and that wasn't a lesson I was willing to keep reinforcing. So I stopped answering immediately. I let messages sit. I gave myself time to think, time to feel what I'd ignored before, the sadness, the anger, the strange relief of finally understanding the rules. I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. If you were me, and you knew they could ignore your pain but not public accountability, what would you do? Would you fade out quietly? Or would you name the truth once and step away? There's no right answer, only honest ones. What I knew for sure was this: they didn't reach out because they missed me. They reached out because the silence stopped protecting them. And once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. I didn't make a decision that day, but something had already shifted. The power dynamic had changed, not because I yelled, not because I exposed anyone, but because the truth finally had weight. And weight creates consequences, whether anyone likes it or not. I didn't come to that realization all at once. It happened in pieces. Late at night, when the house was quiet, when I was tired enough to stop defending everyone in my head, when I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. I sat at the table with that notebook open, flipping through pages I hadn't meant to fill. Each page was simple. No commentary, no conclusions, just facts. A date, a message sent, no reply, another date, an event scheduled, a confirmation received, no follow-up. Page after page, the same shape kept appearing, not chaos, consistency. And that was unsettling, because chaos is easy to excuse. Consistency isn't. Consistency means intention doesn't matter as much as outcome. I realized how much effort I'd spent trying to protect everyone from the consequences of their own behavior. I softened things. I filled in gaps. I assumed good intentions where there was no follow-through. I was doing emotional labor no one had asked for. And the moment I stopped doing it, the truth became obvious. They didn't respond to vulnerability. They responded to exposure. Not exposure in a public sense. Exposure as in reality becoming unavoidable. When something stayed between us, it could be dismissed. When it existed outside of us, it couldn't. That difference explained everything. It explained why my feelings had never moved the needle. It explained why the tone changed once other people noticed. And it explained why I always felt alone in these moments. Because alone is where emotions live. Evidence lives in the open. I thought about all the advice I'd been given over the years. Just talk it out. Be patient. They didn't mean it. None of that addressed the pattern. It only asked me to absorb it quietly. What no one tells you is that patience without accountability just teaches people how long they can keep doing the same thing. I wasn't angry when I understood that. I was tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of translating my pain into something palatable. Tired of being the only one doing the emotional math. So I stopped. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten anything. I just changed what I relied on. Instead of hoping someone would remember, I checked what had already happened. Instead of waiting for reassurance, I trusted what the record showed me. That shift changed how conversations went. I spoke less. I listened more. I noticed how often people contradicted themselves when there was nothing written down. How quickly certainty faded when timelines were questioned. And I noticed something else. Once I stopped leading with emotion, people stopped telling me I was dramatic. Because there was nothing dramatic about a date on a page, or a message left unread, or an empty seat in a photo. Those things don't argue back. They don't escalate. They just exist, and existence has weight. I realized I had been taught to believe that bringing evidence was cruel, that it meant I was keeping score, that it meant I wanted someone to lose. But I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to stay sane. When your reality keeps getting minimized, documentation becomes a form of self-preservation. Not because you plan to use it, but because it anchors you. It tells you, this happened. You didn't imagine it. You're not exaggerating. That mattered more than any apology ever could, because apologies without change are just another way to delay consequences. And consequences were the only thing that had ever produced movement. I didn't confront anyone with proof. I didn't need to. Knowing it existed changed how I showed up. I stopped negotiating with people who only listened when it benefited them. I stopped explaining why things mattered. I let silence sit where explanations used to go. And I watched how quickly concern appeared once silence stopped protecting them. That was the clearest lesson of all. Empathy didn't change the dynamic. Facts did. Not because facts are cold, but because they remove escape routes. Once I understood that, the guilt I'd been carrying started to loosen. I wasn't heartless. I wasn't unforgiving. I was realistic. I could still care. I could still feel, but I didn't have to bleed for it to count. If you were me, after years of being told your feelings were too much, what would you trust more? The emotions that kept getting dismissed, or the record that never changed? That's the question everything came down to. And once I answered it honestly, my decisions stopped feeling emotional. They felt grounded, heavy, measured, final in a quiet way. Because when you stop relying on feelings to be believed and start relying on truth to stand on its own, you don't need to convince anyone anymore. The truth does its job. It waits. And when it finally matters, it creates consequences all by itself. That was the moment I stopped asking myself how to make them understand, and started asking something else. What does the evidence say about who will show up for me when it actually counts? Once you ask that question, you don't need emotions to answer it. The truth already has. Leaving didn't feel like freedom. Not at first. It felt quiet in a way that made every sound louder. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, my own breathing at night when I couldn't sleep. I had made a decision that everyone assumes comes with relief. It didn't. What came instead was space. Too much of it. I woke up the next morning and reached for my phone out of habit. There was no one to update. No one to explain anything to. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a reaction, and that was unsettling. I thought leaving would end the pain. I thought it would close something. It didn't. It changed the shape of it. The sharp edge was gone, but what remained was heavier. Guilt showed up in small ways. At the grocery store, when I reached for something my mom used to buy, in the car, when a song came on that used to mean home. I missed people who had hurt me. That confused me more than anything. because I knew why I left. I had evidence. I had clarity, but my body hadn't caught up yet. At night, I replayed conversations that never happened. Ones where things were said differently. Ones where someone finally understood. I'd wake up tired. Not because I regretted the decision, but because grieving doesn't care how logical you are. I realized something important during that time. Leaving doesn't erase attachment. It just removes access. And attachment has its own timeline. There were moments I felt alone in a way I hadn't felt before. Not the loneliness of being ignored. The loneliness of choosing yourself and still feeling empty. I wondered if I had done it wrong, if I should have stayed longer, explained more, given one more chance. That voice was persistent. It sounded reasonable. It asked questions like, was it really that bad? Couldn't you have handled it differently? I went back to the notebook, not to convince myself again, but to ground myself. The facts didn't change. The pattern didn't disappear just because I missed them. That helped, but it didn't make the ache go away. Some days, I felt strong, clear, certain. Other days, I felt small, like I'd abandoned something sacred. No one tells you that setting boundaries can feel like betrayal, even when you're the one who's been hurt. I had to learn to sit with that discomfort, not rush past it, not justify it away, just sit with it. Leaving wasn't a dramatic exit. There was no final speech, no door slammed. It was paperwork, phone calls, a name that no longer fit, quiet changes that didn't look like strength from the outside. Inside, it felt like standing still after a storm. Everything looked different, but nothing felt settled yet. I started noticing how often people expect you to be okay once you leave, as if distance fixes grief, as if self-respect comes without loss. It doesn't. You lose the fantasy, the version of family you hoped might exist one day. That loss deserves space too. I had to grieve people who were still alive. Grieve conversations I'd never have. Grieve holidays that would feel different. Grieve the idea that things might suddenly change. That grief didn't mean I was wrong. It meant I was human. There were moments I almost reached out, not to reconcile, just to feel familiar again. I stopped myself each time, not out of anger, out of honesty. I asked myself a question I kept coming back to. If you were me, missing people who only noticed you when it cost them something, what would you do? Would you trade your clarity for comfort, or would you let the discomfort pass? I learned that pain after leaving isn't a sign you failed. It's a sign you didn't numb yourself to survive anymore. When you stop suppressing things, they surface. That's not weakness. That's processing. I let myself miss them. I let myself feel guilty. I didn't rush to label it growth or healing. I just let it be what it was. Some days I ate dinner alone and stared at the wall. Some days I felt proud of how far I'd come. Both could exist at the same time. That was new for me. I wasn't forcing myself to be strong anymore. I wasn't performing resilience. I was just living in the aftermath of a hard choice. And slowly, something shifted. The emptiness didn't disappear, but it softened. I started filling the space with things that didn't require permission. Rest. Silence. Relationships that didn't ask me to shrink. The guilt lost its grip when I stopped arguing with it. I didn't need to prove that leaving was the right decision every day. I only needed to remember why staying wasn't sustainable. Leaving didn't make me happy overnight. It gave me room. Room to feel things honestly. Room to rebuild without pretending. Room to exist without constantly managing someone else's comfort. If you're watching this and you've left, or you're thinking about it, I want you to hear this part clearly. If it still hurts, that doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. If you miss them, that doesn't cancel the harm. If you feel alone sometimes, that doesn't mean you failed. It means you stepped out of something familiar. And familiar doesn't always mean safe. Healing doesn't arrive as relief. Sometimes it arrives as quiet, as space you don't know what to do with yet, as nights where you sit with yourself instead of bracing for someone else. Leaving didn't erase the pain, but it stopped creating new evidence of it, and that mattered more than immediate comfort. I wasn't healed. I wasn't fixed, but I wasn't bleeding in the same place anymore, and that was enough to keep going. The pain didn't disappear. It changed, and learning to live with that change was part of choosing myself, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. I used to think family was something you earned, that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, succeeded enough, there would be a moment where everything balanced out, where effort turned into belonging. It didn't work like that. What I learned, slowly, was that family isn't supposed to be a performance review. You don't get points for being easy. You don't get promoted for being patient. You don't become worthy by absorbing neglect gracefully. For a long time, I confused endurance with maturity. I thought growing up meant asking for less, needing less, making myself smaller so things stayed peaceful. No one told me that peace built on silence is fragile. It only holds as long as one person keeps swallowing everything. When I stepped away, I thought I was rejecting my family. That wasn't true. I was rejecting a role. The role where I had to prove my value through sacrifice. The role where love was conditional on convenience. The role where being independent meant being optional. Distance gave me perspective I didn't have before. I started noticing how often love had been framed as tolerance, how often loyalty meant compliance, how often the burden of keeping the family together had landed on the person who was already alone. That wasn't tradition. That was imbalance. I stopped asking myself why they couldn't show up. I started asking why I kept believing it was my job to make it easier for them. That question changed everything. Because once you see that dynamic clearly, you realize how much of your energy went into managing disappointment. You plan around absence. You lower expectations. You celebrate yourself quietly so no one feels uncomfortable. And then you call that strength. But strength that costs you your sense of worth isn't strength. It's survival. There's a difference. Real maturity doesn't mean you stop needing care. It means you stop pretending you don't. I didn't leave because I hated my family. I left because loving them required erasing myself, and that wasn't sustainable. Family, as I understand it now, isn't the place where you prove you deserve to exist. It's the place where your existence doesn't need justification, where showing up isn't conditional, where care isn't rationed, where love doesn't disappear when you stop performing. That definition took time to settle in. There were days I questioned it, days I wondered if I'd asked for too much. But then I'd remember how little I'd actually asked for. Presence, honesty, basic consideration. Those aren't unreasonable demands. They're the foundation. I also learned that walking away doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you honest. Gratitude doesn't require self-abandonment. Respect doesn't mean enduring harm quietly. And loyalty isn't proven by how much pain you can tolerate. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could carry. I started measuring it by how much I was allowed to be myself. That shift didn't fix everything, but it gave me a compass. When new relationships entered my life, I noticed how different things felt. I didn't have to explain my boundaries. I didn't have to minimize my needs. I didn't have to justify why something mattered. Care was consistent, not dramatic, not loud, just there. That's when it really clicked. What I had been missing wasn't effort. It was reciprocity. Family isn't defined by who you share a name with. It's defined by who shows up without being asked, who listens without defending themselves, who doesn't make your pain an inconvenience. That doesn't mean cutting everyone off is the answer. It means clarity matters more than obligation. It means you're allowed to choose environments that don't require you to shrink. Some people will never agree with that. They'll say you changed. They'll say you became distant. They'll say you broke something. But distance doesn't destroy healthy connections. It exposes unhealthy ones. I don't regret leaving. I regret how long I believed I had to earn the right to be treated well. If you're watching this and something feels familiar, if you've been the strong one, the easy one, the invisible one, I want you to sit with one question. If you were me, how much proof would you need before you stopped trying to convince yourself it was normal? Family shouldn't be the place where you feel most alone. It shouldn't require you to disappear to be accepted. And it definitely shouldn't make you prove over and over that you're worthy of care. You don't outgrow the need to matter. You outgrow spaces that refuse to see you, and choosing yourself doesn't mean you failed at family. Sometimes it means you finally understood what family was supposed to be. Not a test, not a negotiation, not a reward, but a place where your presence is enough. No evidence required,